up on the world today. The U.S. says a Chinese scientist suspected of visa fraud is being protected inside the Chinese consulate in San Francisco. Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari in the Malian capital, Bamako, to intervene in the country's political crisis. Plus, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen once again praises the EU's recovery package against COVID-19. A warm welcome to the program today. I'm Akaite Afia here in Lagos. We are learning another Chinese consulate, this time in San Francisco, has come under the radar of the U.S. government, which is claiming a Chinese scientist suspected of visa fraud and of concealing ties to the military may be hiding there. Let's remember the U.S. government on Wednesday ordered the closure of the Chinese consulate in Houston and threatened to close down more Chinese missions. Court filings by prosecutors in a federal court in San Francisco say the defendant named Huan Tang was a biology researcher at the University of California, Davis. According to the filings during an interview with FBI agents last month, Huan said he had not served in the Chinese military. It adds that as the case demonstrates, the Chinese consulate in San Francisco provides a potential safe harbor for a plea of official intent of avoiding prosecution in the United States. Prosecutors say this is not an isolated case, but appears to be part of a program conducted by the PLA to send military scientists to the U.S. on false pretenses. Meanwhile, the Chinese Foreign Ministry says the Chinese embassy and consulates in the United States have always been law-abiding, and allegations of China's consulate general in Houston are totally malicious slanders. Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Wang Wenbin said refuting comments made by the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and other U.S. officials who have accused the Chinese consulate general in Houston of interference in U.S. internal affairs, theft of U.S. intellectual property, and commercial espionage. He said over the past 40 years and more, the Consulate General in Houston has been dedicated to promoting mutual understanding and cooperation in various fields between various circles of China and the United States, and has done a lot of friendly work to this goal. As global number of infections from the coronavirus have been growing, so have the numbers in the United States, which is just inches away from the 4 million mark. A number of U.S. states have also been setting new records in infections and deaths, such as California, Missouri, North Dakota, and West Virginia. Here's the global update.
Official guidance on revised rules for face coverings in England have been published. From Friday, coverings will be compulsory in enclosed public spaces, including supermarkets, indoor shopping centers, transport hubs, banks, and post offices. Over in Spain, authorities say face masks should be worn even at home if residents are with people they don't live with. Spain already has Europe's strictest rules on masks. In Madrid, they are mandatory everywhere in public. Away from Europe, wearing face coverings outside the home is now mandatory in the Australian city of Melbourne and Mitchellshire. The move came into effect on Thursday after a surge in cases in the state of Victoria. As America continues to grapple with the biggest outbreak in the world, infection numbers are nearing 4 million. Deaths resulting from the virus have also risen to more than 143,000. New York, which was hit hardest at the onset of America's outbreak, continues to have the highest number of deaths in the country, but infection rates have risen sharply during recent weeks in southern states like Florida and Texas. California, the most populous U.S. state, has already overtaken New York in case numbers. A new report says the South African Medical Research Council is reporting a huge discrepancy between the country's confirmed COVID-19 deaths and the number of excess deaths from natural causes. The report shows that more than 17,000 excess deaths in South Africa from May the 6th to July the 14th, as compared to data from the past 2 years, while confirmed COVID-19 deaths are 5,940. And in the Middle East, coronavirus cases have passed the 100,000 mark in Iraq. The news comes as the country resumes commercial flights from some cities for the first time in several months. Neighboring Iran remains the worst affected country in the Middle East, with more than 284,000 cases and over 15,000 deaths. And finally, a hospital in the southern French city of Lyon is testing patients with a new machine that enables them to breathe into a tube to see whether they have COVID-19 in a matter of seconds. The machine is entering a second trial phase after 3 months of use on dozens of people, among which about 20 were patients with the virus and others without. Unlike the uncomfortable standard PCR tests, the machine is not invasive and provides an immediate result.
Here in Africa, the number of COVID-19 cases has passed 750,000, with South Africa becoming one of the top 5 most affected countries in the world, just behind the United States, Brazil, India, and Russia. It was just this Monday, the executive director of the WHO's emergency program, Mike Ryan, warned that South Africa could be a precursor for the continent, and that we really need to take what is happening in Africa very seriously. Many countries on the continent have imposed restrictions on public gatherings and international travel, and introduced curfews through many, including South Africa, who has attempted to ease those restrictions in order to reopen their hard-hit economies. Just a slight detour from the coronavirus pandemic itself, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari is in the Malian capital, Bamako, his first international trip since the coronavirus pandemic began, and probably one of the first on the continent still since the pandemic began. President Buhari is part of a West African leaders delegation on a mission to defuse Mali's long political crisis, which has raised concerns of further instability in a country grappling with multiple crises, including an escalating conflict. They will be meeting with President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta and key figures of the opposition coalition behind the recent protests known as the June 5th movement. The meeting comes after former Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan, the ECOWAS special envoy to the country, briefed President Buhari on the political situation in Mali. Well, back to COVID-19, doctors in the UK are using 3D printed model to understand the impact the coronavirus has on the lungs at the height of the infection. The life-size model, made with Axial 3D with Formlabs 3D printers, was taken from a CT scan of a patient at Belfast Health and Social Care Trust 14 days into the infection and will be used for surgical planning. While the patient concerned survived, there may be long-term damage caused by the virus. The model shows in the yellow inflammatory pus and scar tissue that sits within the airways that was stopping the patient from getting oxygen into their blood. While the whole world is trying to ease its way out of the global pandemic, Britain and the European Union have been trying to find common ground on negotiation, seeing as the country has not made a complete break from the European Union. Talks are, however, not going as planned, as both sides clash today over the chances of securing a free trade agreement, despite London holding out hope one might be struck. Since Britain left the bloc in January, talks on the trade agreement and other future ties have all but stalled, with each side accusing the other of failing to compromise before a transition period runs out at the end of this year. The UK's chief negotiator, David Frost, described the bloc's proposals on reaching a deal as failing to meet the government's demands to be treated as an independent country.
Well, we have made progress in areas like trade in goods and services, transport, social security cooperation, EU programmes, participation, and so on, which is good, but nevertheless big differences do remain, in particular on the familiar questions of the level playing field, so-called level playing field, and fisheries policy. The EU has listened to us in some areas. We have made clear our concerns about the role of the European Court in any future agreement, and the EU has listened to that. And for our part, similarly, we have listened to the EU's concerns about the structure of the future agreement and avoiding complexity. So there has been movement, but the gaps are still significant, and we have to try and move forward in the next month or two, the end of the year.
Meanwhile, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator says the UK has shown no willingness to break the deadlock on the level playing field and fishery issues, making sealing a new trade agreement unlikely.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You are very welcome to today's online briefing.
The EU has always insisted that an economic partnership with the UK must include robust level playing field rules and an equitable agreement on fisheries. This means, simply, that by its current refusal to commit the condition of open and fair competition and to a balanced agreement on fishery, the UK makes a trade agreement at this point unlikely.
EU leaders are also still focused on the new recovery package for states during this pandemic. President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, again praised the agreement to finance the recovery package as a huge historic step for the 27-nation bloc. However, the European Parliament has to give its approval to the spending plan over the next several months before it can become reality and help lift the EU from a recession caused by the COVID-19 pandemic.
The big winner of this summit are the new own resources. We have now a unanimous agreement on the need for new own resources. We have a clear timetable, and we have them linked to repayment. And this is a huge and historic step forward for our Union, which both the Commission and the Parliament have long been pushing for. Now we have no time to waste. And this is
A German court today convicted a 93-year-old German man of helping to murder 5,232 prisoners, many Jewish, at a Nazi concentration camp in World War II, and handed him a suspended 2-year sentence in one of the last cases against Nazi-era crimes. The Hamburg court said the man, known as Bruno D., who had been an SS guard in the Struthof concentration camp near Gdansk in what is today Poland, was guilty of being involved in killings between August 1944 and April 1945. He had acknowledged his presence at the camp, but argued that did not amount to guilt. About 65,000 people, including many Jews, were murdered or died at Struthof, according to the museum's website. Prosecutors have argued that there were many shot in the back of the head or gassed with lethal B gas. Federal police and demonstrators clashed outside Portland's Justice Center in the early hours of today as a Black Lives Matter protest in the city continued. Protests have rocked Portland every night for weeks, with security forces often tear gassing and clubbing demonstrators. Fires burned outside the center as protesters, some pointing lasers, pushed against the security fence around the building. Federal agents housed in the center showed no sign of retreating, regularly going out of the building to throw smoke bombs and tear gas towards protesters. The deployment of federal agents in Portland last week is a flashpoint in a national debate over civil liberties and what demonstrators and local officials see as a political ploy by President Donald Trump, who is facing an uphill re-election battle. Coming up ahead on The World Today, China says it has successfully launched its first unmanned mission to Mars. Stay with us. Welcome back to The World Today. Just before the break, we were discussing the protests going on in Portland. But before the protests that continued this morning, U.S. President Donald Trump announced a plan to send federal agents to more U.S. cities to crack down on violent crime. He said Operation Legend program would continue would include cities such as Chicago and Albuquerque, New Mexico, in a further effort by federal officials to tackle violence.
It's an honor to be with you today. Americans must hold their city leaders accountable. They must insist that community officials fully support, fully back, and fully fund their local police departments. There is simply no substitute for a police department that has the strong backing of city leaders. In the meantime, we will use federal law enforcement to vigorously charge federal crimes and support these besieged communities to the greatest extent possible. My administration will be working to remove dangerous offenders sprung loose by these deadly policies and, frankly, by these deadly politicians. America must be a sanctuary for law-abiding citizens, not criminal aliens.
Well, we want to dig some more into the developments in the United States. So our correspondent, Maria Bird, joins us now from Washington. Maria, great to see you.
Good to see you as well.
So tell us, what more can you tell us about what U.S. President Donald Trump has said about Operation Legend and what that will look like?
Well, Operation Legend is named after a 4-year-old that was killed in Missouri. And so this is really about, what he believes is a defunding of the police departments and really allowing our communities to be plagued with potential violence. Of course, many across the United States don't believe that. They believe that, that the U.S. has a lot of work to do as it relates to being able to address policing and police brutality in the U.S. But he is, as you said, he is sending troops and federal agents to the Chicago area, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and potentially other states across the country. Now, many mayors and many city officials across the country are very upset by this. They're asking that he not send federal agents. They believe they can handle the issues in their cities on their own. But again, we know that we're up against and we're headed toward the November election. We know that he has stood for law and order since the beginning of his administration. And so for those who are following President Trump, this is another way for him to say, listen, I am a law and order president, and we will have law and order in the country. And so this is another way for him to continue to push for what he has started with his campaign over 4 years ago.
And as Trump continues to push that law and order presidency for himself, I mean, understandably, the Black Lives Matter protests are still ongoing because some of the policemen behind the killing of African Americans have not been brought to justice. But where are we now with the calls for police reform, and what other impacts have the protests had on the American justice system?
Well, the protests have had major impacts on the federal justice system. I mean, we can see already that George Floyd has totally changed and evolved where Americans feel and believe about what needs to be done in the United States with police reform. Now, the greatest challenges are, as you mentioned, we're still seeing African Americans dying at the hands of police, and we're still seeing police brutality occurring. And we know that there are still police officers that are out there that have not yet been convicted or even been brought to trial for some of the crimes that have occurred. But that does not mean that the work has not made any movement forward. Where we are today is we're really seeing that local governments are taking strong actions to try to reform internally. We have not really seen from a federal level what is going to be done overarchingly to address it. Obviously, President Trump believes that law and order is his way, that he is addressing the issues surrounding what he believes has been somewhat of an attack on police officers. But to really address the Black Lives Matter, we have not been able to make federal headway, but obviously local communities. And as we all know, it's the grassroots that really has changed America throughout history.
Definitely. And moving a little bit away from these grassroots protests, President Donald Trump says more Chinese consulates may be shut down, and the government says it has discovered a fugitive has been hiding in the consulate in San Francisco at this point. So what does the near future hold for U.S.-China relations?
U.S.-China relations, I think that ever since, it's been several months now. I mean, if you look at, President Trump is still calling the coronavirus the Chinese virus. And so we know that tensions have continued to escalate. We know with the consulate in Houston closing down as of tomorrow. They gave them 72 hours to close that down. And now with this new information, and we know that this vaccine, I mean, it's a race, it's a global race to who's going to be the first to release a vaccine. And so with this scientist and with what some believe that she has some ties with the Chinese military and just a myriad of things that potentially could, in some respects, be harmful to the security and the intelligence of the U.S., that San Francisco is definitely in danger as well of potentially seeing some of the ramifications that Houston has seen.
Yes, well, Maria, thank you so much again for joining us today.
Thank you.
And finally, China says that it has successfully launched an unmanned probe to Mars today in its first independent mission to another planet, a bid for global leadership in space, and a display of its technological prowess and ambition. China's largest carrier rocket, the Long March 5Y-4, blasted off with the probe at 12:41 p.m. from Wenchang Space Launch Center on the southern island of Hainan. The probe is expected to reach Mars in February next year, where it will attempt to deploy a rover to explore the planet for 90 days. If successful, the Tianwen-1, or Questions to Heaven, which is the name of the poem written 2 millennia ago, will make China the first country to orbit, land, and deploy a rover in its inaugural mission. China's probe will carry several scientific instruments to observe the planet's atmosphere and surface, searching for signs of water and ice. China previously made a Mars bid in 2011 with Russia, but the Russian spacecraft carrying the probe failed to exit the Earth's orbit and disintegrated over the Pacific Ocean. Well, that's all for the world today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Akaite Afia. Stay safe.